Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The last flight. As I stepped into the cockpit, the familiar hum of the aircraft enveloped me like a warm blanket. The cockpit lights flickered on, casting a gentle glow across the dials and instruments that had become an extension of my own being. I was Captain Andrew Miller, a pilot with over 15 years of flying experience, yet today felt different. There was an unsettling weight in the air, a whisper of something ominous lurking just beyond my reach. The day was clear, with not a cloud in sight. Passengers settled into their seats, and the flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, preparing for our journey. I glanced at the manifest, 25 souls entrusted to my hands. My hands, which had flown through storms, turbulence, and even mechanical failures, now trembled slightly as I took hold of the controls. Good afternoon, everyone. This is your captain speaking. We're expecting a smooth flight to Denver today. The weather looks clear, and we should be cruising at 35,000 feet in no time. My voice, though steady, seemed to echo unnaturally in the cockpit. I brushed it off, attributing it to pre-flight jitters, but the feeling lingered. As we taxied down the runway, my mind wandered back to a year ago, a flight I couldn't forget. It was a routine journey that turned into chaos. A sudden engine failure. Panic. I had managed to land safely, but the memory of those frantic moments haunted me. The nagging thought that it could happen again gripped me as I pulled the throttle back and we surged into the sky. Moments later, the aircraft was in the air, and I leaned back slightly, allowing the autopilot to take over. I closed my eyes for just a second, the hum of the engine soothing me. But as I reopened them, I noticed something strange. The altitude indicator flickered erratically, a spasm of numbers that made no sense. A chill ran down my spine, and I reached for the controls, trying to shake off the unease. Is everything okay up there? My co-pilot, Jenna, looked at me with concern etched across her face. She had only been flying for a few years, but her instincts were sharp. Just a glitch, I think, I replied, forcing a smile. I'll check the readings. But deep down, a voice whispered that it was more than just a technical issue. As we climbed higher, the atmosphere inside the cockpit shifted. The lights flickered again, and the instruments began to behave erratically. I gripped the yoke tighter, a cold sweat forming on my brow. Jenna's face paled as she studied the instruments. I could sense her fear, and it amplified my own. Captain, we might need to inform the passengers, she said, her voice trembling slightly. What if there's something wrong with the aircraft? I wanted to assure her that everything was fine, but a creeping dread filled the space between us. I decided to make a quick check of the systems. My heart raced as I realized that several critical systems were malfunctioning, the very systems I have relied on for years. As I began my assessment, the aircraft jolted violently. Alarms blared, piercing the tense atmosphere like a knife. I felt the world tilt beneath me, the cockpit bathed in flashing red lights. My training kicked in as I fought to regain control, but the unsettling truth crept in: we were no longer flying a routine flight. Suddenly, the intercom crackled, and the familiar voice of the head flight attendant came through. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. But her words barely registered. My focus narrowed to the controls, each adjustment sending shivers down my spine. In that moment, as fear coursed through my veins, I realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever was happening was tied to something much deeper, something I couldn't yet comprehend. My heart raced as I fought to steady the aircraft. The alarms continued to scream, their relentless wailing blending with the thudding of my pulse in my ears. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of my training. Focus. Analyze. Act. Yet the instruments before me seemed to mock my efforts, flashing erratically and spiraling into chaos. "Jenna, check the backup systems," I barked, my voice sharp. She nodded, her fingers flying over the controls, but I could see the fear in her eyes as she struggled to keep her composure. The plane shook violently, and the passengers' murmurs turned into frantic whispers. I could feel their anxiety rippling through the cabin, the palpable tension mixing with the sterile smell of the cockpit. I could imagine the expressions of fear on their faces, the worried looks exchanged between strangers. But I had to remain calm. I had to be their anchor in this storm. "Captain, I'm getting some unusual readings from the altimeter," Jenna said, her voice shaking slightly as she adjusted her headset. "It's fluctuating between 32 and 38,000 feet." I swallowed hard. Fluctuations like that were alarming. They indicated a serious malfunction. "Let's switch to manual control," I said, wrestling with the yoke as I disengaged the autopilot. My hands felt clammy against the cool metal, and I could hear the engines roaring beneath me, but it felt like they were fading away, drowning in the cacophony of alarms. "Cabin crew, prepare for possible emergency landing," I instructed over the intercom, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're experiencing technical difficulties, but we will keep you informed." The words felt hollow, the uncertainty clawing at my throat. I could sense the unease in the cabin. It was a living entity, breathing and thrumming with fear. "Andrew," Jenna said, breaking my concentration. "Look at that." She pointed toward the window. My gaze followed her finger, and my stomach dropped. Below us, an ominous storm was brewing, dark clouds roiling like a living beast. Lightning flickered within, illuminating the turbulent mass. The stark contrast between the serene sky above and the chaos below sent chills racing down my spine. "Is it possible to divert?" Jenna asked, her eyes wide, reflecting the tumultuous weather below. "Too late," I replied, my voice strained. The plane lurched again, this time more violently. I fought to steady my grip on the controls, each movement feeling more desperate than the last. The storm was closing in, and we were headed straight for it. As the turbulence intensified, I stole a glance at the passenger cabin. Some were gripping their armrests, eyes wide with fear, while others were trying to comfort each other, murmuring soothing words that felt inadequate. I spotted a young boy clinging to his mother, his small face twisted in terror. In that moment, I felt the weight of my responsibility. These lives were in my hands, and the gravity of that truth pressed down on me like a physical force. "Hold on, everyone. We're going to ride this out," I shouted through the intercom, trying to sound reassuring. But my own voice felt foreign, tinged with an edge of panic. "Systems are failing," Jenna shouted, her eyes darting over the gauges. "We need to make a decision now." I glanced at the emergency protocols flashing in my mind. There was a procedure for this, a set of steps I could follow, but the reality of our situation was unraveling faster than I could react. My training seemed distant and abstract against the backdrop of the storm. Suddenly, the plane dropped. My stomach lurched, and I felt weightless for a split second before gravity slammed back into me. I struggled to keep my composure, fingers tightening around the yoke as I steadied the aircraft. Then, a loud bang echoed through the cabin, and the plane shuddered violently. Alarms blared even louder now, and I braced myself against the control panel, fear coursing through me like ice. "Mayday! Mayday!" I shouted, pushing the radio button frantically. "This is Flight 347. We're experiencing severe turbulence and technical failures. Requesting immediate assistance." Static crackled, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. What if no one heard us? What if this was the end? "Andrew," Jenna said, her voice a mere whisper. "We need to descend. The storm is too strong. We have to get out of this." Nodding, I punched in a rapid descent, the plane responding sluggishly. I could feel the pressure of the storm pressing down on us, thick and suffocating. With every passing second, I could sense something more than just a mechanical failure. It felt like we were being drawn into a trap, something beyond our control. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was not merely a storm. It was a force, a darkness that had entwined itself around me, echoing with whispers from my past. Memories surged forward, unbidden and raw, reminders of that fateful day I had tried to forget. The chaos, the screams, the crash landing. All of it came rushing back as I fought to keep us in the air. A sudden jolt shook me from my thoughts, and I realized we were descending faster than intended. I could see flashes of light from the storm through the cockpit windows, illuminating the turbulence around us. This was it, the moment I had dreaded, the moment I had feared the most. I fought against the controls, battling the forces of nature and the ghosts of my past, desperate to keep my grip on the present. But as the storm raged around us, I knew I was losing the battle. The aircraft shuddered violently, the storm's fury threatening to swallow us whole. Rain pelted the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists, and I could barely see the horizon beyond the chaos. I tightened my grip on the yoke, forcing myself to focus. "Jenna, activate the emergency systems. We need to stabilize the plane." Her fingers moved quickly over the controls, a mix of determination and fear etched on her face. "I'm trying, but the systems aren't responding." The tension in her voice mirrored the anxiety pulsing through me. As I struggled to maintain control, the lights flickered in the cockpit, casting eerie shadows against the instruments. The rhythmic beeping of alarms filled the air, a symphony of dread. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing the mounting chaos around us. Come on," I muttered under my breath, coaxing the aircraft to respond. I felt as if I were battling not just the storm, but also an unseen enemy, a force that seemed determined to drag us into the depths of despair. In the midst of the turmoil, I caught a glimpse of something in the clouds, a shadow that flickered just at the edge of my vision. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light. "Focus, Andrew," I muttered to myself. "You've got this." But the shadow returned, darker and more pronounced. It twisted and writhed among the storm clouds, almost as if it were alive. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a product of the stress I was under. But the longer I stared, the more it felt like a premonition, a warning from something beyond my understanding. "Jenna, can you see that?" I asked, trying to gauge her reaction. "See what?" she replied, glancing toward the clouds. "There's too much rain. I can't see anything." I turned back to the controls, fighting to ignore the creeping dread. The shadow flickered again, and a bolt of lightning illuminated the cockpit, casting everything in stark relief. For a brief moment, the world outside was visible, a chaotic mix of swirling clouds and relentless rain. "Prepare for a rough ride," I warned, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt the aircraft lurch again, the turbulence growing more severe. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain again. We are encountering severe weather conditions. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." My voice trembled slightly, betraying my own anxiety. I glanced back at the cabin, catching sight of the passengers. Fearful faces stared back at me, some whispering prayers while others clutched their loved ones tightly. I felt their fear wash over me like a wave, and it drove me to push harder against the controls. I couldn't let them down. "Jenna, I need you to communicate with air traffic control again." "We need guidance," I said, trying to suppress the tremor in my voice. "Trying," she shouted, her fingers flying over the radio controls. "But there's so much interference. I can't get through." The realization settled in my gut like a stone. We were isolated, trapped in this maelstrom with no way out. The storm was a cage, and I could feel its oppressive weight closing in. "Keep trying," I urged, fighting the panic rising in my chest. "We need to find a way to break through." As the plane shook again, I felt a sudden lurch that sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through me. The shadow reappeared, more defined now, swirling ominously within the storm clouds. I could almost make out shapes, figures reaching out, writhing in agony, their silent screams echoing in my mind. "Andrew!" Jenna's voice broke through my haze of terror. "Look out!" I turned back to the front just in time to see a flash of light streaking toward us. "Brace for impact," I shouted, gripping the yoke with all my strength as I pulled up. The aircraft screamed in protest, the engines roaring as I fought against the oncoming force. The world outside exploded in a blinding flash of white. The cockpit was engulfed in light, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, darkness. When my vision cleared, the cockpit was filled with a suffocating blackness. I blinked rapidly, trying to orient myself. Alarms blared, and the red emergency lights cast a ghostly glow across the instruments. I could hear Jenna breathing heavily beside me, her panic palpable. "Are we?" she started, but I cut her off, forcing myself to focus on the instruments. "Check the systems," I barked, my voice sharp. "We need to regain control." She fumbled with the buttons, her hands trembling. "It's all offline. The main power is out." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Without power, we were vulnerable, a feather tossed in a storm. "Can we reset anything?" I asked, desperate for a solution. "Maybe the emergency battery," she replied, frantically flipping switches. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. The storm raged outside, a cacophony of wind and rain pounding against the fuselage. I could hear the passengers murmuring nervously behind us, their anxiety palpable. I could sense their fear mingling with my own, a living, breathing entity pressing down on us. As Jenna worked frantically, I felt a creeping sensation along the back of my neck. It was as if someone was watching me, an invisible presence hovering just beyond my field of vision. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, only the shadow of the storm swirling beyond the cockpit. "Andrew!" Jenna's voice pulled me back. "I've got the emergency battery powered up. We have some systems back online." "Good. Let's stabilize our altitude," I said, trying to rein in the rising tide of panic. I forced myself to breathe deeply, focusing on the instruments in front of me. But the weight of the shadow in my mind remained, a constant reminder of the past I had tried to escape. As we leveled out, the storm outside roared with fury. I could feel the aircraft bucking like a wild stallion, each jolt a reminder of how fragile our existence was. But I was determined to fight back. "Jenna, what's our altitude?" I asked, trying to gauge how close we were to the ground. 30,000 feet and descending," she shouted. "We need to get out of here. Find a way to reach air traffic control." I demanded, my heart racing. "We have to alert them to our situation." "I'll try again," she said, her fingers flying over the radio. But all I could hear was static, a harsh reminder of our isolation. I felt a sudden surge of desperation. It was as if the storm was feeding off my fear, amplifying it until it was a living, breathing entity of its own. I glanced outside again, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw figures within the clouds, faces twisted in anguish, reaching out as if to drag me into their despair. "Andrew, focus!" Jenna snapped, her voice cutting through the haze. "We can't let fear control us." Her words resonated deep within me, and I forced myself to concentrate. I had trained for emergencies. I had faced challenges before. But this was different, this felt personal. "Let's prepare for a possible emergency landing," I said, trying to steady my voice. "We might need to find an airport nearby." "Roger that," Jenna replied, her voice steadying. "I'll pull up the nearest locations." As she worked, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Yes, we were in danger, but I wasn't alone. The passengers behind us were counting on me, just as I was counting on Jenna. We were in this together, and together we could fight back against the storm. I glanced at the shadow flickering in my peripheral vision, and this time I refused to acknowledge it. I was done letting fear dictate my actions. I was a pilot, and I would get us through this. But as the storm continued to rage around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play, something waiting just beyond the clouds, biding its time until we were our most vulnerable. The aircraft trembled violently, each lurch echoing through my bones. I fought to maintain control as Jenna worked feverishly beside me, her fingers dancing over the controls with a mix of fear and determination. The dim emergency lights flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that flickered across the cockpit. "Andrew, I've got the nearest airports on the radar," she said, her voice strained but resolute. "There's a small airport about 20 miles north of our position. We might be able to make it there if we can maintain altitude." "Let's head for it," I replied, my heart racing. The thought of landing on solid ground was a glimmer of hope amid the storm's chaos. "Get the landing gear ready, and let's prepare for an approach." "Copy that," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. I could see the sweat beading on her forehead, the strain of the situation weighing heavily on both of us. As I focused on navigating the turbulent air, the shadow flickered again in my peripheral vision, more distinct this time. It felt like a memory clawing at the edges of my mind, pulling me back to that fateful day, a day I had buried deep within my thoughts. I had never spoken about it, but the pain of that loss lingered like a specter, haunting me with every turbulent turn. "Andrew?" Jenna's voice snapped me back to the present. "We need to make a decision now. The storm is closing in." I shook my head to clear the memories that threatened to overwhelm me. "We can do this. We just need to focus on the landing." "How's the fuel?" "Critical but manageable," she replied, her voice steadying. "We can make one approach before we need to land." I nodded, forcing my gaze forward. The clouds swirled menacingly outside, dark and angry, as if they were alive and intent on dragging us down. "All right, let's do a test on the landing gear," I instructed, my voice firm. As Jenna worked to engage the landing gear, the cockpit fell into a tense silence, interrupted only by the whir of machinery. Each passing second felt like an eternity. I glanced at the altimeter, 25,000 feet and descending rapidly. The ground was approaching faster than I would have liked. "Gear down," Jenna announced, her fingers moving quickly to confirm the deployment. A jolt shot through the aircraft as the wheels locked into place. I felt a flicker of relief. "Okay, we're set for landing. Let's start our approach." But as I maneuvered the plane toward the airport, the storm intensified, whipping around us with an almost predatory ferocity. Rain lashed against the windows, obscuring my view of the ground below. I strained to catch sight of any familiar landmarks, but all I could see was a swirling mass of gray. "Where's the runway?" I shouted over the roar of the engines. "Can you see anything?" "Not yet," Jenna replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's too dark." The shadow loomed larger in my vision, its presence more pronounced. I shook my head again, forcing myself to concentrate on the task at hand. The specter of my past had no place here, not while lives depended on me. Suddenly, the aircraft shuddered violently again, and alarms blared louder than before. "What now?" I growled, fighting against the controls. "Engine failure," Jenna shouted, her face pale. "We're losing power. Stabilize the altitude. We can't let it drop," I commanded, my heart racing. The memories of that other flight, the screams, the panic, resurfaced, overwhelming me. I couldn't let this happen again. Jenna worked furiously, her hands trembling as she toggled switches, trying to divert power to the remaining engine, but it's not responding. The cockpit felt like it was closing in on me, and the weight of the storm outside pressed down like an iron vice. I could feel the panic rising, a familiar tide threatening to engulf me. But I fought back, clenching my fists around the yoke. "Stay calm. We've trained for this." "Andrew, the storm, it's too strong." Jenna's voice broke, her fear palpable. "We can't keep this up." But I refused to accept defeat. I focused on the instruments, ignoring the shadows creeping in the corners of my vision. "Get ready for emergency procedures. We may need to land without power," I said, forcing the words out. "Roger that," she replied, her voice shaky but determined. "I'll prepare for a glide approach." As we leveled out, the plane felt like a fragile shell amid the storm's fury. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of the past pressing down on me, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't let it control me. I wouldn't let it. "Where's the runway?" I asked again, scanning the clouds frantically. "Just a bit further," Jenna shouted, her eyes wide with fear and determination. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the area for a brief second. I caught a glimpse of the airport below, a small strip of pavement surrounded by darkness. "There," I pointed, adrenaline surging through me. But as I angled the plane toward the runway, the shadows surged again, more forceful this time. I could hear the echoes of the past, a child's laugh, the sound of laughter turning to screams, the memory of that day when everything had shattered. "Focus, Andrew," I yelled at myself, forcing my mind back to the present. "You can't think about that now." The storm roared in response, as if mocking my resolve. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, and I struggled against the rising tide of dread. "You're down," Jenna shouted, her voice breaking through the noise. "Down," I confirmed, feeling the aircraft begin to settle as we descended toward the runway. I concentrated on the instruments, my heart pounding in my chest. The ground rushed up to meet us, and the moment of truth loomed ahead. "Brace for impact," I shouted, my voice hoarse. We hit the ground hard, the wheels screeching against the asphalt as the plane bounced violently. The alarms blared louder, a cacophony of panic and chaos. I fought to keep the aircraft steady, straining against the forces that threatened to rip us apart. But then, the plane skidded to the side, careening off the runway and into the darkness beyond. I felt a surge of terror as we hurtled toward the unknown, memories of the past crashing over me like a wave. In that moment, I couldn't tell where the storm ended and the shadows began. All I knew was that I had to fight for my life, for Jenna, for the passengers trapped in the cabin with me. "Hold on," I shouted as the plane careened wildly, my heart racing. But just as the darkness began to swallow us whole, something shifted. The world outside turned eerily quiet, and I felt the shadows recede. The storm around us faded into a distant roar, and in that silence, I realized this was just the beginning. The aircraft skidded across the ground, metal groaning in protest as it fought against the momentum. My heart pounded in my chest, each thud a reminder of the precarious situation we were in. The world outside was a blur of darkness and rain, the storm's fury still swirling around us, but it felt oddly muted, as if we had crossed some invisible threshold into a different realm. "Jenna, are you okay?" I managed to ask, my voice tight with concern. "I think so," she replied, her face pale but determined. "But we need to get the cabin secured and assess the damage." I nodded, adrenaline coursing through my veins. We had survived the initial impact, but the danger was far from over. The cabin was still filled with passengers, their safety now resting squarely on our shoulders. "Let's check the emergency systems," I said, grabbing the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've landed, but we're experiencing some difficulties. Please remain calm and stay seated with your seatbelts fastened." My voice trembled slightly, but I forced myself to project confidence. As I unbuckled my seatbelt, a wave of dread washed over me. I glanced toward the cabin door, where the shadows seemed to cling like a fog, obscuring what lay beyond. The memory of that day, the crash, the panic, the loss, threatened to engulf me again. But I couldn't let that happen. Not now. "Let's move," I said, taking a deep breath. "We need to help the passengers." Together, we navigated through the narrow aisles, the sound of the storm still howling outside. The cabin was dimly lit, the emergency lights flickering erratically as we made our way to the rear. The murmurs of concern grew louder as we approached, and I could see the fear etched on the faces of those who had entrusted their lives to us. "Is everyone all right?" I called out, trying to sound reassuring. A few passengers nodded, but others looked uncertain, their eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" a woman asked, clutching her child tightly. I swallowed hard, forcing down the memories threatening to resurface. "We encountered unexpected turbulence, but we're on the ground now. We'll get you to safety." As I moved deeper into the cabin, I could feel the tension rising. The shadows at the back seemed darker, swirling in a way that made my skin crawl. I turned to Jenna, who was working to calm the passengers. "Check for injuries," I instructed, my voice firm. "We need to assess how bad it is." "On it," she replied, her eyes scanning the cabin. I continued down the aisle, my heart racing as I caught glimpses of the faces around me. There was fear, confusion, and a hint of desperation. "We're here for you," I assured them, though my own voice felt shaky. But as I moved further back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, oppressive. I glanced toward the emergency exit, and my stomach twisted as the shadows seemed to writhe closer, inching toward me like a predator stalking its prey. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the rear of the cabin, causing everyone to jump. I turned to see a man struggling to open the emergency exit. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, panic lacing his voice. "Stop!" I yelled, rushing toward him. "You can't open that door. The storm outside is too dangerous." He froze, fear flashing across his face as he looked at me. "What are we supposed to do then?" "We're trapped." "No, we're not," Jenna interjected, moving to my side. "We need to stay calm. Let's get everyone organized. We can wait for rescue." But the man shook his head, his desperation palpable. "Rescue? We're going to die in here." The tension in the cabin escalated, and I could feel panic rising like a tide. I stepped closer to the man, lowering my voice. "Listen to me. We are trained for emergencies. We just need to stay calm and work together." His breathing slowed slightly, but I could see the fear still lurking in his eyes. What if the storm gets worse? I felt a chill creep down my spine as I considered his words. "We'll find a way," I said, though uncertainty gnawed at me. As I moved back to the front, I could see Jenna trying to comfort the passengers, but the unease in the cabin was palpable. The shadows felt more alive than ever, creeping closer with each passing moment, a reminder of the darkness I had tried to leave behind. "Andrew, we need to get communication back online," Jenna called, her voice steady. "If we can reach air traffic control, we can get help." I nodded, grateful for our focus. "Right. Let's see if we can get the radio working." We made our way back to the cockpit, the shadows swirling behind us, as if they were clinging to our every move. Once inside, I glanced at the controls, the dim lights flickering ominously. The emergency radio was still functional, and I hurried to try to establish a connection. "Mayday, Mayday! This is Flight 273. We're on the ground and in distress." I shouted into the radio, the static crackling in response. "Andrew, listen," Jenna said, pointing to the gauges. "The storm is shifting. We need to be quick." "Mayday, Mayday!" I repeated, my heart racing. "We need assistance. We're at a small airport, 20 miles north of." The radio erupted in static, cutting off my words. I slammed my hand against the console in frustration. Come on. But just then, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the cockpit, and in that instant, I saw it, a dark figure looming just outside the window, its form indistinct but undeniably there. "Did you see that?" I gasped, my heart racing. "See what?" Jenna looked over, her brow furrowing in confusion. "The figure," I exclaimed, my voice trembling. It was right there. She glanced outside, her eyes wide with alarm. "There's nothing there, Andrew. You're just seeing things." "No," I interrupted, the memory crashing over me. The faces from my past were creeping in, their anguish pressing down on me. "It's not just in my head. It's real." "Focus," she shouted, her voice cutting through the fog of panic. "We need to get the radio working. Help will come if we just stay calm." Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to focus. You're right. Let's try again. I tuned the radio, desperately searching for a signal as the storm continued to howl outside. I could feel the shadows lurking, watching, waiting for the moment when I would falter. Mayday, Mayday! This is Flight 273. I repeated, forcing my voice to stay steady. We are on the ground and in distress at a small airport. We need assistance immediately. Static crackled back at me, but this time there was something different, an answer, faint but unmistakable. Flight 273, this is air traffic control. What is your status? Relief flooded through me. We're on the ground. We've experienced severe turbulence, and we need emergency assistance. Roger that. We're dispatching help your way, the voice responded, and I could feel the tension start to lift slightly. Thank you, I said, my voice breaking with emotion. But as I turned to Jenna, the shadows surged closer, flickering at the edges of my vision. My heart raced as I felt their presence intensifying, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. Andrew! Jenna's voice broke through the chaos. Focus on the passengers. We need to keep them calm. I took a deep breath, pushing back against the tide of fear. You're right. Let's get back to them. As we left the cockpit, I glanced back at the shadowy figure, feeling its gaze piercing through me. It was a reminder of the past I had tried so hard to escape. But I wouldn't let it control me. Not now. Together, we moved back into the cabin, determination fueling my steps. Ladies and gentlemen, we've contacted air traffic control, and help is on the way, I announced, forcing a smile even as anxiety twisted in my gut. The passengers looked up, a flicker of hope igniting in their eyes. We're going to be okay, I assured them, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. But as I looked into their faces, I realized something profound. I couldn't let my past dictate my future. I was a pilot, and I would protect them at all costs. Stay calm, and we'll get through this together, I said, my voice steady. The shadows receded slightly, but I could still feel their presence lurking just beyond the light. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we huddled in the cabin, the storm continuing to rage outside. My heart thumped in my chest, a constant reminder of the tension that permeated the air. Each gust of wind sent the aircraft shuddering, and the shadows seemed to writhe around us, as if sensing our fear. Andrew, Jenna said softly, drawing me aside as the passengers whispered anxiously among themselves. We need to establish an exit plan just in case. If help doesn't arrive soon, we might need to evacuate. I nodded, forcing my mind to focus on the task at hand. You're right. Let's formulate a plan. We gathered the passengers' attention, and I tried to project calm even as uncertainty gnawed at me. Ladies and gentlemen, we're still waiting assistance, I began, my voice steady. In the meantime, I need everyone to listen carefully. If we need to evacuate, we'll use the front exit first. Stay calm and follow my instructions. I could see the fear in their eyes, the silent question, what if help doesn't come? The shadows seemed to feed off that fear, creeping closer, and I felt a chill run down my spine. But I had to remain strong. I had to be the pilot they trusted. As I moved back toward the cockpit, Jenna followed. Andrew, what if we have to make a run for it? She asked, concern etched on her face. I can't shake this feeling. It's like something is watching us. I feel it too, I admitted, glancing back toward the cabin where shadows lurked just out of sight. But we can't let it control us. We need to be ready for anything. Just then, another loud thud echoed from the rear of the cabin, sending a jolt of fear through me. What was that? I asked, my heart racing again. I don't know, Jenna replied, her voice tense. I'll check it out. No, I'll go, I said, taking a step toward the source of the noise. Stay here and keep an eye on the passengers. Be careful, she cautioned, her eyes wide with concern. With a deep breath, I moved toward the back of the cabin, my heart pounding in rhythm with each step. The dim emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I approached the door to the rear compartment where the thud had originated. As I reached for the handle, a sudden chill enveloped me, and I hesitated. The memories surged again, blurring the line between the present and the past. No, I whispered, shaking my head. Focus. I twisted the handle and pulled the door open. The compartment was dark and cluttered, filled with cargo. I scanned the area, but everything appeared to be in place until I noticed something in the corner, a dark shape partially hidden beneath a tarp. I took a step closer, my pulse quickening. What is that? I muttered, pulling back the tarp. As the fabric fell away, I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It was an old flight jacket, worn and faded, with a name stitched on the breast, Michael Sinclair. The memories crashed over me like a wave, and for a moment, I was transported back to that day, the day I had lost everything. Andrew. Jenna's voice cut through the haze, and I turned to see her standing in the doorway, fear etched on her face. What did you find? It's nothing, I stammered, trying to push the memories away. Just an old jacket. She moved closer, glancing at the jacket. It's not just any jacket. This was Michael's, your brother's. The words hung heavy in the air, and I felt the weight of grief descend upon me like a suffocating blanket. I thought I'd left this behind, I whispered, my voice breaking. Jenna stepped closer, her eyes softening with understanding. You can't run from your past, Andrew. But you can confront it. You have to face what happened. The shadows seemed to swirl closer, and I fought to suppress the panic rising within me. I can't, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Not again. But as the storm raged outside, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had. I need to tell you what happened, I said, my voice steadying. Maybe that's the only way to break free from this. All right, Jenna encouraged, her expression supportive. Whenever you're ready. I felt a flicker of hope amid the turmoil. It was 5 years ago, I began, my heart racing. Michael and I were on a routine flight. Everything seemed normal until the engine failed. I was at the controls, and I couldn't regain control. We crashed. Jenna listened intently, her expression softening as I recounted the story. I lost him that day. He was my brother, my best friend. I couldn't save him. Tears threatened to spill, but I forced them back, the memories clawing at my throat. I blamed myself for so long. I thought I'd moved on, but here it is, haunting me again. Jenna placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. You're not alone, Andrew. You've got me, and you've got the passengers. They need you now. Suddenly, the cabin filled with a blaring alarm, jolting us back to the present. What's happening? I shouted, rushing back to the cockpit. Check the instruments. Jenna yelled, her eyes wide with alarm. I hurried to the controls, my heart racing as I glanced at the readings. "We're losing cabin pressure," I shouted, panic surging through me. "Deploy the oxygen masks," Jenna ordered, her voice urgent. "We need to act fast." I moved quickly, fumbling to activate the emergency systems. The masks dropped from their compartments, and I could hear the passengers gasping in shock. "Put on your masks," I called out, my voice firm. "Stay calm." The shadows swirled more violently around us, as if responding to the chaos. I felt the weight of my brother's loss pressing down, but I couldn't afford to give in to despair. Jenna grabbed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an emergency. Please put on your masks and remain seated." As I struggled to regain control, I could see the panic in the eyes of the passengers. Their fear was palpable, but I had to focus. I turned to Jenna. "We need to land this plane, now." "Understood," she replied, her hands moving swiftly over the controls. "I'll help you with the descent." Together, we worked to stabilize the aircraft, my heart pounding as the storm continued to howl outside. I could feel the shadows pressing in, but I pushed through, determined to break free from the grip of my past. "Just focus on the landing," Jenna encouraged, her eyes fixed on the instruments. "We can do this together." With renewed determination, I fought against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I was a pilot, and this was my moment to reclaim my strength. I couldn't let the past dictate my future. As we descended through the storm, the shadows receded slightly, and the howling winds transformed into a low, haunting whisper. The ground rushed up to meet us, and I could see the runway lights flickering in the distance. "Prepare for landing," I shouted, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Gear down," Jenna called out, her voice steady. With each passing second, we hurtled toward the runway, and I felt the weight of everything, the past, the present, and the uncertain future, colliding in that moment. We touched down hard, the wheels screeching against the asphalt. The aircraft shuddered violently, but I fought to keep it steady. "Hold on," I shouted, gripping the controls tightly. The plane skidded across the runway, and I could feel the shadows lingering, but this time, I refused to let them take hold. I was in control, and I would land this plane. As we finally came to a stop, the cabin erupted into a chorus of relieved gasps and applause. I slumped back in my seat, my heart racing as the reality of our situation sank in. We had made it. Jenna turned to me, a smile breaking through the tension. "We did it. You did it." But as I looked out at the storm fading in the distance, I felt the shadows retreating into the night. The memories of my brother lingered in the back of my mind, but I knew I had faced my fears and survived. In that moment, I understood that I would carry the past with me, but it wouldn't define me. I was a pilot, and no storm, no shadow, would ever take that away from me again. Nightmares. Have you ever wondered if a new beginning could be the end of you? My name is David, and I recently moved into a modest apartment in a quiet part of town. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to escape the shadows of my past. The day I signed the lease, I felt a flicker of hope. Little did I know, that flicker would soon be extinguished. The apartment was small but cozy, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards that echoed every step I took. The previous tenant had left in a hurry, leaving behind the faint scent of stale cigarettes and a few forgotten belongings. As I unpacked, a sense of unease settled over me, a whisper that something wasn't quite right. Every night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. It was a silence that felt almost alive, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I brushed off the feeling, attributing it to the stress of the move. But as the days turned into weeks, that sense of foreboding only grew stronger. The first nightmare came on Tuesday. I remember it vividly. The details were so striking that I woke up drenched in sweat. I found myself in a dark room, the air thick with an unnameable dread. Shadows twisted and curled at the edges of my vision, and in the center stood a tall figure, its face obscured by darkness. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, chilling my very soul. Just as I tried to scream, I jolted awake, heart racing, the oppressive silence of my apartment wrapping around me like a shroud. At first, I thought it was just a fluke, a side effect of the stress from moving. But the nightmares persisted. Each night brought new horrors, each dream more vivid and terrifying than the last. Sometimes I would wake up with the sensation of someone, or something, watching me from the shadows. I would sit up in bed, my breath caught in my throat, straining to hear any sounds that might reveal my unseen watcher. But the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock, mocking my fear. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a manifestation of my anxiety. I began to keep a journal by my bedside, writing down every detail of my dreams, hoping that by confronting them, I could reclaim some semblance of control. But as the days passed, my waking life began to bleed into my nightmares. I would see the same shadows lurking in corners, hear whispers when no one was around. Each day felt like a step deeper into a dark abyss, and I was powerless to stop it. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that my nightmares were more than just dreams. They felt like warnings, premonitions of something lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I forced myself to maintain a routine, thinking that structure might chase away the creeping dread. Each morning, I would brew a cup of coffee and sit by the window, letting the sunlight pour over me like a balm. I watched the world outside, a parade of joggers, dog walkers, and the occasional child chasing a soccer ball. But inside, the shadows loomed larger with each passing day, whispering secrets that taunted my fragile sanity. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table scribbling in my journal, a peculiar noise drew my attention. It was a soft tapping, rhythmic and almost deliberate. I paused, my pen hovering above the page, heart racing. The sound seemed to be coming from the bathroom. My initial instinct was to dismiss it as the plumbing settling or the old building creaking, but the noise continued, insistent and unnerving. Curiosity piqued, I pushed back my chair and walked toward the bathroom. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew cold, and the tapping ceased. I turned on the light, illuminating the cramped space filled with faded tiles and a small mirror that hung crookedly on the wall. I approached the mirror, half expecting to see the figure from my nightmares reflected back at me. Instead, all I saw was my own pale face, eyes wide with uncertainty. Then, I noticed something strange. The mirror seemed to warp and ripple as if it were alive. I leaned closer, searching for the source of the unsettling feeling that clawed at my chest. That's when I saw it, a fleeting shadow darting behind me. I whipped around, but the bathroom was empty, save for my own reflection staring back at me, now wide-eyed and panicked. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind. Perhaps I was just tired, too deeply entrenched in my own fears. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to wash away the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. But as I looked up at the mirror once more, I couldn't help but notice a faint, almost imperceptible smudge on the glass. It looked like a handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against it from the other side. My heart raced as I stepped back, suddenly aware of the pounding of my heart echoing in the silence. Determined to push the incident aside, I returned to my room, but sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, the shadows in my apartment taking on a life of their own. The tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent, a constant reminder of the darkness that seemed to seep from the walls. When I finally drifted off, the nightmares came crashing back with a vengeance. This time, I found myself in an endless corridor, each door I opened leading to more darkness, more despair. The figure from my previous dreams stood at the end of the hall, waiting. I felt a familiar coldness wrap around me, paralyzing my limbs. The closer I got, the more I could make out its features, twisted, ghastly, eyes filled with malice. It reached for me, and just as its fingers brushed my skin, I woke up screaming, the sound echoing off the walls of my small apartment. I lay there, heart racing, drenched in sweat, and for the first time, I felt the weight of isolation press down on me. I was alone, surrounded by walls that seemed to close in with every breath I took. I grabbed my journal, my lifeline, and scribbled down the details of the dream, hoping to expel the horrors from my mind. But as I wrote, I realized the figure wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was becoming part of me, manifesting in my reality. The next morning, I decided I needed a break from the confines of my apartment. I ventured out for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The sun hung high in the sky, casting warm rays that momentarily chased away the shadows of my dreams. I wandered aimlessly, lost in thought, until I stumbled upon a small cafe. The comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee beckoned me inside. Sitting at a corner table, I watched people go by, laughter, chatter, life. It felt like a world away from the oppressive silence of my apartment. I allowed myself to relax, if only for a moment. I ordered a cup of coffee and pulled out my journal, ready to write about my experience. As I began to jot down my thoughts, I felt a sudden chill sweep through the cafe. I looked up, and for a brief second, I caught a glimpse of a dark figure standing outside, watching me through the window. My heart sank. Just then, the cafe door swung open, and a rush of laughter filled the space, breaking the spell. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I shook my head, trying to dispel the image from my mind. Was I losing my grip on reality? I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I had moved here to start fresh, to escape the shadows of my past. But the nagging feeling wouldn't let go. As I left the cafe, a lingering thought haunted me. What if my nightmares were only the beginning? Returning to my apartment felt like stepping back into a world where sunlight had never dared to shine. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, and the familiar scent of stale air wrapped around me, igniting the anxiety I tried so hard to shake off. I dropped my bag on the floor, feeling the weight of my restless thoughts settle back on my shoulders. That night, I decided to keep the lights on. I arranged a few lamps around the living room, casting a warm glow to ward off the darkness that crept in from the corners. As I settled onto the couch, I flipped through channels, trying to find a distraction. But nothing could take my mind off the lurking dread. The shadows in the apartment seemed to stretch and elongate, almost as if they were alive, waiting for me to look away. I flipped through my journal, reviewing the entries about my nightmares. The more I read, the more I realized how vivid and consistent they were becoming. Each dream featured the same figure, a faceless entity that seemed to grow stronger with each passing night. It felt like a dark cloud hovering over me, ready to strike when I least expected it. Sleep finally overtook me in the early hours of the morning, and the nightmares returned with a vengeance. This time, I found myself back in the corridor, but it was different, darker, and more oppressive. The air was thick, heavy with an unshakable sense of despair. As I wandered through the hallway, each door I opened revealed glimpses of my past, twisted and distorted, echoing my fears and regrets. I saw moments from my childhood, memories I thought I had buried long ago, shouting, crying, loneliness. Then I heard it, the sound of soft, mocking laughter echoing through the hall. I turned to see the figure standing at the end, but this time it wasn't just a silhouette. I could see its outline more clearly. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long, bony fingers that seemed to curl and twist unnaturally. It beckoned to me, urging me to come closer, and though I wanted to flee, my legs felt rooted to the ground. In a moment of despair, I took a step forward, compelled by a force beyond my control. Just as I reached out, the laughter stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled backward, crashing into a door that swung open, revealing a room filled with mirrors. They lined the walls, reflecting a distorted version of myself, each image more grotesque than the last. I turned to run, but the figure was there, blocking my escape. Its eyes, two dark voids, seemed to pull me in, draining the very life from my body. I gasped, waking up in my bed, heart pounding, gasping for air. The room was dark, the shadows creeping closer as if they had grown bolder while I slept. I sat up, drenched in sweat, and for a moment, I thought I heard a soft whisper, like a distant echo of my own name. David, it taunted, sending a shiver down my spine. I flicked on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. The shadows retreated slightly, but the feeling of dread clung to me like a second skin. The next morning, I decided I needed to confront this head-on. I researched the history of my apartment building, hoping to uncover any secrets that might explain the sinister presence that plagued me. The internet offered me a maze of information, some of it unsettling. The building had a dark past, haunted by rumors of its previous tenants, a history of mental illness, strange occurrences, and even a few unexplained disappearances. As I read through the stories, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Could it be that I had unknowingly moved into a place steeped in darkness? The thought sent me spiraling into despair, but I couldn't ignore it. I needed to know what I was dealing with. That evening, I decided to explore the basement of the building, a place I had avoided since moving in. Armed with only my phone's flashlight, I descended the creaky stairs, the air growing cooler and more damp with each step. The basement was dimly lit, the faint flickering of a single bulb casting long, eerie shadows across the concrete walls. As I moved deeper into the space, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. I pushed through the maze of old boxes and discarded furniture, each creak of the floorboards echoing like a warning. Then, in the far corner, I saw it, a door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Rusty hinges and dark wood contrasted sharply with the starkness of the basement. My heart raced as I approached it, drawn by an inexplicable urge to see what lay beyond. With a deep breath, I reached for the doorknob, and the moment my fingers brushed against it, a cold wind swept through the basement, extinguishing the bulb and plunging me into darkness. I felt panic rising in my chest. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the pitch black. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness inviting me in. I hesitated, my mind racing with the possibilities of what could be on the other side. The whispers began again, a cacophony of voices blending together, each one calling my name, each one laced with an urgency that made my skin crawl. "David, come, find us." Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down further into the darkness. The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified, wrapping around me like a shroud. I took a step forward, and with that step, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, as if the very air had become charged with something sinister. I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what awaited me in the depths below. The staircase creaked ominously beneath my weight, each step sending a shiver up my spine. The light from my phone flickered as if reluctant to illuminate the darkness below. I hesitated, the soft whispers still swirling around me, merging into a single haunting voice that echoed in my mind, urging me onward. As I descended, the air grew denser, thick with a musty odor that hinted at neglect and decay. The walls, lined with peeling paint and damp patches, seemed to close in on me, trapping me in this hidden realm beneath the surface of my apartment. The only sound was the faint thudding of my heart, a metronome marking my descent into the unknown. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a dimly lit room, the walls shrouded in shadow. My flashlight beam danced across the space, revealing remnants of the past, a broken chair, a dusty old trunk, and scattered papers that whispered of lives long gone. The air was thick with memories, echoing the voices of those who had walked this path before me. I stepped further into the room, my curiosity mingling with fear. That's when I noticed the far wall, covered in strange symbols and faded graffiti, a chaotic tapestry of scrawls and markings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. They were reminiscent of the sigils I had read about in occult texts, symbols of protection and warnings against evil. My breath hitched as I traced the lines with my eyes, realizing they told a story, one of desperation and pleading, a plea for escape from whatever darkness lurked here. In the center of the room stood a small, circular table, its surface marred with deep scratches. It was adorned with an array of items, a tarnished locket, a broken pocket watch, and a few crumpled photographs, their faces faded and unrecognizable. I picked up one of the photos, squinting to see the figures within. They were smiling, but a sense of foreboding washed over me. I felt as if they were staring back, their eyes filled with an unspoken warning. Just as I was about to place the photo back on the table, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A loud bang echoed from behind me, reverberating through the room like thunder. I spun around, my heart racing, and saw the door I had entered through swinging shut as if an invisible force were pushing it closed. Panic surged through me, and I rushed toward it, but as I reached for the knob, the door slammed shut with a deafening finality. Trapped. The reality of my situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I was alone, in a room filled with shadows and whispers, the air growing colder by the second. I turned back to face the room, my flashlight beam shaking as I desperately searched for another way out. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. There, among the shadows, stood the figure from my nightmares, its form indistinct yet unmistakable. It seemed to blend into the darkness, a silhouette of malice and dread. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by fear. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows, its presence suffocating. "David," it whispered, its voice a haunting echo, low and melodic, like a lullaby sung by a ghost. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled backward, colliding with the table, scattering the items across the floor. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of pleading voices urging me to leave. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Was this a dream? A cruel trick of my mind? But the chilling reality was right in front of me. "Leave while you still can," it continued, its voice wrapping around me like a vice. "They are watching. They want you." Instinct kicked in, and I turned to the wall of symbols, desperate to find some meaning, some way to protect myself. I had read about banishing rituals, about how to confront darkness with light. The memories of my research flooded back, and I felt a spark of determination. "Stay away from me. I shouted, the words echoing in the oppressive space. I could feel the energy in the room shift, the shadows retreating slightly as my voice pierced the darkness. I needed to assert my presence, to reclaim control over this nightmare. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. "You do not understand," it hissed, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. "You are part of this now. You cannot escape." Fueled by adrenaline, I dashed toward the door, pounding on it with all my strength. "Let me out!" I screamed, the panic rising within me. The whispers grew louder, drowning out my pleas, a cacophony of voices urging me to stop, to give in. Suddenly, the door shuddered and swung open, the light from the staircase spilling into the room. I didn't think twice. I bolted through the doorway, sprinting up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows clawed at me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, but I refused to look back. I burst through the door at the top of the stairs, slamming it shut behind me, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The apartment was quiet, the familiar sounds of life outside barely breaking through the walls. But I could still feel the darkness lingering, pressing against the boundaries of my reality, threatening to consume me. That night, I locked every door and window, barricading myself against the creeping shadows that haunted my mind. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still watching, waiting for its moment to strike. The weight of my fears settled heavily on my chest, and sleep became a distant memory, replaced by an insidious paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a whisper, every shadow a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond my sight. I clung to my journal, my only solace, writing furiously, trying to make sense of the chaos swirling in my mind. But no amount of ink could erase the chilling truth. My nightmares were no longer confined to the realm of sleep. They were becoming my reality. I was trapped in a cycle of fear, a puppet dancing to the strings of a darkness that refused to let go. Days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next, as the haunting presence of my nightmares seeped further into my waking life. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, going through the motions of daily routines while inside. I felt as though I were unraveling at the seams. Every shadow felt like an intruder, every flicker of light threatened to expose me to the lurking darkness. I avoided sleep whenever I could, relying on caffeine and sheer willpower to keep me awake. The days turned into sleepless nights, and soon, the lines between reality and nightmare began to blur. I would find myself staring into the mirror, searching for the remnants of the man I once was. The reflection that stared back seemed foreign, haunted by a fear I could no longer articulate. The bags under my eyes grew heavier, the light in my gaze flickering like the dying bulb in the basement. One evening, desperate for an escape, I ventured out into the city, hoping the bustling streets would distract me from the relentless shadows that chased me home. I wandered aimlessly, drifting past cafes and shops filled with laughter and warmth. But even among the crowds, I felt isolated, a ghost moving through a world of vibrant life that felt unreachable. As night fell, I found myself at a small bookstore tucked away in a quiet alley. The scent of old paper and ink wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. I browsed the shelves, searching for something, anything, that might offer clarity. That's when I stumbled upon a book with a faded cover, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age. The title, Whispers of the Forgotten, caught my eye. It was an account of urban legends, tales of haunted places, and the dark secrets they held. As I flipped through the pages, I found a section dedicated to my building. My heart raced as I read about the history of the place, stories of previous tenants who had experienced similar nightmares. The accounts detailed strange occurrences, lights flickering, objects moving on their own, and the feeling of being watched. It painted a picture of a house steeped in sorrow, as if it fed on the fears of those who dared to dwell within its walls. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I read about a tenant who had vanished without a trace. The haunting tales mirrored my own experiences, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into a web of darkness that was far beyond my control. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages, absorbing the warnings and the tales of survival. It was a desperate search for answers, but each revelation only deepened my sense of dread. I left the bookstore with the weight of the book clutched to my chest, a heavy reminder of the darkness that awaited me at home. The night air felt thick and suffocating as I made my way back to the apartment, a gnawing anxiety gnawing at the edges of my sanity. That night, I decided to confront the shadows head-on. Armed with my journal and the book I had found, I prepared myself for a long night of vigilance. I lit candles around the apartment, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating a cocoon of light against the encroaching darkness. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, I opened the book to the section about rituals meant to ward off evil. The words felt foreign on my tongue, yet I repeated them, trying to imbue them with meaning and strength. The air grew heavier, thick with anticipation, as I whispered the incantations into the dimly lit room. The candles flickered violently, and a cold breeze swept through the apartment, extinguishing some of the flames and plunging the space into semi-darkness. I fought the urge to panic, clinging to the belief that I was taking a stand against the encroaching darkness. My heart raced, pounding against my ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. As I continued to read aloud, I suddenly heard a soft tapping sound, barely perceptible above the rustle of the pages. My breath caught in my throat, and I paused, straining to listen. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the room like a heartbeat, rhythmic and insistent. Then, the whispers returned, swirling around me, a haunting symphony of voices pleading and wailing. "Help us, help us," they echoed, filling the space with a palpable desperation. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and the shadows seemed to close in, wrapping around me like a shroud. "Who are you?" I shouted, the fear spilling out into anger. "What do you want from me?" The shadows seemed to twist and writhe in response, forming a figure that loomed in the corner of the room. It was indistinct, a swirling mass of darkness that ebbed and flowed, but I could feel its presence bearing down on me, heavy and oppressive. "Join us," the voice whispered, low and seductive. "Embrace the darkness. We are waiting." I recoiled, fear clawing at my insides. "No, I won't let you take me," I cried, clutching the book to my chest as if it were a lifeline. The room shook, and a surge of wind swept through, knocking over the candles and plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse racing as I fought to regain control over my surroundings. The whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, but I clung to the words of the book, repeating the incantations until they became a mantra. "Leave me alone," I shouted into the void, my voice breaking. The shadows shrieked in response, a cacophony of sound that filled the room, echoing off the walls. I felt the temperature drop, the air turning icy as if the darkness itself were manifesting in front of me. Suddenly, I was hit with a vision, a flash of memories that didn't belong to me, snippets of pain and despair that flooded my mind. I saw faces twisted in agony, their eyes filled with fear, and I realized these were the spirits trapped within the darkness, those who had come before me, unable to escape the cycle of torment. "Help us," the voices pleaded, intertwining with my thoughts, and I felt a pang of sorrow for their suffering. I couldn't help but empathize. Their pain was real, their need for release palpable. But it was also a trap, a lure to draw me deeper into their world. With a sudden surge of determination, I pushed the thoughts away, focusing on my own will to survive. I refuse to be a part of this, I declared, my voice steadying as I drew strength from my own resolve. In that moment of clarity, the figure recoiled, the shadows thrashing violently as if struck by an unseen force. I seized the opportunity, charging toward the door, heart racing as I flung it open and stumbled into the hallway. The cool air hit my face, grounding me as I rushed out of the apartment, fleeing the darkness that had threatened to consume me. I ran down the stairs, not stopping until I burst into the night, gasping for breath, my heart racing with adrenaline. Outside, the world felt impossibly bright, the stars twinkling overhead as if celebrating my escape. But deep inside, I knew this was far from over. The darkness had only retreated, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. That night, I wandered the streets, aimlessly searching for solace among the busy crowds, but the whispers followed me, a haunting reminder of the malevolent presence that lurked just beyond the reach of light. I was in a race against time, a battle for my sanity, and the night was far from over. The cool night air rushed past me as I wandered through the streets, the cacophony of the city a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of my apartment. The whispers had quieted, but their haunting echo remained etched in my mind, a reminder that I couldn't escape the darkness that had invaded my life. I desperately sought refuge in the bustle of the city, hoping to drown out the lingering shadows, but the relief was temporary, a thin veil over a growing terror. I made my way to a small diner, the neon lights flickering like stars in the distance, offering a semblance of warmth and normalcy. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of coffee and grease enveloped me, grounding me in the present. The clatter of plates and murmur of conversations provided a distraction, but even as I settled into a booth, my heart raced. The waitress approached with a warm smile, her eyes bright and inviting. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice a soothing balm against the backdrop of my anxiety. "Just coffee, please," I replied, my voice hoarse, the fatigue settling in my bones. As I waited, I tried to focus on the ordinary world around me, couples chatting, friends laughing, the soft clink of utensils. I took a deep breath, attempting to center myself, but the sensation of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. It was as if the shadows had followed me, lurking just out of sight, eager to reclaim me. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down with a gentle smile. "You look like you've had a long night." "Everything okay?" she asked, concern etching her features. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," I replied, forcing a smile that felt brittle. As I sipped the hot coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the chatter in the diner, their insidious presence creeping into my thoughts. Help us, they echoed, reverberating in my mind. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a gust of cold air swept through the diner. I turned to look, my heart pounding, and froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure cloaked in shadow, the outline indistinct yet unmistakably familiar. It was the same entity from my nightmares, its presence sending a chill coursing through my veins. I felt the room shrink around me, the laughter and conversations fading into a distant murmur as panic surged through me. The figure stepped forward, its features obscured, but the intensity of its gaze bore into me, compelling and terrifying. "David," it called, the sound weaving through the air like a sinister melody. "You cannot escape us." In that moment, I knew I had to fight back. I couldn't allow it to invade this space, to spread its darkness beyond the confines of my mind. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, drawing the attention of the diners around me. Their faces reflected concern, but I was beyond that. I had to confront the entity, to reclaim my reality. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice ringing with desperation. The diner fell silent, all eyes on me as I took a step toward the figure. "You don't belong here." The figure recoiled slightly, as if taken aback by my defiance, but it quickly regained its composure, a sinister grin spreading across its shadowy form. "You think you can banish me?" it taunted, its voice dripping with malice. "I am part of you now." "No!" I yelled, the words spilling out of me like a flood. "You don't own me." With each declaration, I felt a surge of power, as if the very act of speaking against it was weakening its hold on me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the book I had found, the pages filled with rituals meant to banish darkness. I brandished it like a shield, the words dancing in my mind, ready to be unleashed. "By the light of truth, I cast you out," I shouted, my voice steadying as I recited the incantation from memory. The air crackled with energy as I spoke, the shadows in the diner flickering with uncertainty. The figure trembled, its form blurring as if struggling against an unseen force. The diner patrons watched in awe and confusion, their expressions a mix of concern and disbelief. The shadows swirled around me, but I stood firm, fueled by my determination. "Leave this place," I commanded, focusing all my will on the entity. "You are not welcome here." The figure shrieked, a sound that echoed like shattered glass, reverberating through the diner. The lights flickered violently, and for a moment, I feared that the darkness would engulf me. But I held my ground, pouring every ounce of strength into my words. "Begone!" I shouted, my voice a rallying cry against the encroaching shadows. The air shimmered with energy, a brilliant light illuminating the space as the entity writhed in protest. And then, with a final, piercing scream, it disintegrated, dissolving into a cloud of darkness that dissipated into the air, leaving behind a heavy silence. The light steadied, the diner returned to its usual rhythm, but I could still feel the remnants of its presence lingering, a reminder that the battle was far from over. The patrons stared at me, their expressions a mixture of shock and curiosity. I sank back into my seat, heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The waitress approached cautiously, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, her voice grounding me in reality. "Yeah, I think so," I replied, still trying to catch my breath. But deep inside, I knew I had merely won a battle, not the war. The darkness would return, and I had to be ready. That night, I returned to my apartment, the familiar walls now feeling like a cage. I locked every door and window, every creak of the building sending a shiver down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only delayed the inevitable. I sank into my bed, the weight of the day pressing down on me. I closed my eyes, hoping for a moment of peace, but the whispers returned, softer now yet still persistent. Help us, they murmured, a haunting reminder of the souls trapped within the darkness. As I drifted off to sleep, I knew that I needed to confront the source of the darkness. I needed to discover the truth behind the whispers, to break the cycle of torment that had ensnared so many before me. Tomorrow, I would search for answers, for a way to truly banish the shadows that had claimed my life. But for now, I allowed the darkness to embrace me, the line between sleep and nightmare blurring once more. Morning came too quickly, the sun's rays spilling into my apartment like fingers of light reaching for me. I awoke with a start, my heart racing and sweat clinging to my skin. I lay still for a moment, allowing the remnants of my nightmares to fade into the background, but the whispers still lingered, echoing through my mind like a haunting refrain. Help us, help us. I rose from the bed, the heaviness in my chest growing with each passing moment. Today, I would face the source of the darkness that had invaded my life. I had to know the truth behind the nightmares, to uncover the history of the apartment that had become my prison. After a quick breakfast and a shower, I set out to the local library, determined to dig deeper into the building's past. The scent of old books filled the air as I entered, and the soft rustle of pages turned created an oddly comforting atmosphere. I approached the librarian, an elderly woman with silver hair and wise eyes. "I'm looking for information on the history of the building at 105th Avenue, I said, my voice steady despite the dread pooling in my stomach. She nodded, her expression shifting to one of recognition. "Ah, that place has quite the reputation," she said, leading me to a section filled with local history. "Many have come seeking information about the tenants and events that transpired there." I scanned through the archives, my heart pounding as I sifted through newspaper clippings and historical records. Each article revealed tales of despair, loss, and tragedy that had unfolded within those walls. Tenants spoke of strange occurrences, of feeling watched, of disappearing under mysterious circumstances. My stomach twisted as I read about the very tenants who had been tormented by nightmares, each one mirroring my own experience. As I flipped through a particularly yellowed page, I stumbled upon an account that sent chills down my spine. It was a story about a woman who had lived in the apartment decades ago. She had been a vibrant artist, known for her beautiful paintings, but as her time in the apartment lengthened, her mental state deteriorated. Friends recounted her descent into madness, her art transforming into grotesque depictions of shadows and despair. It was said that she had painted the very darkness that now plagued me. The final entry detailed her tragic fate. She had vanished one night, leaving behind only a single painting, a dark, swirling canvas filled with shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with life. It was then I understood. The darkness I felt was not just a figment of my imagination, but an entity birthed from the sorrow and anguish of those who had come before me. My heart raced as I pieced the fragments together. This was not merely a haunting, it was a cycle of torment, a legacy passed from tenant to tenant. I had to confront the woman who had painted the darkness that had become my nightmare. With a sense of purpose, I returned to my apartment, the weight of the book still in my hands. I needed to find that painting, to confront whatever had become of it, to face the embodiment of the darkness that had plagued so many before me. As I entered the apartment, the air felt charged, as if the very walls were aware of my intentions. The whispers grew louder, almost eager, filling my ears with their desperate pleas. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the rising tide of fear. I began to search through the apartment, starting with the basement where the strange occurrences had first begun. Each step echoed ominously, and I felt a sense of foreboding as I descended the stairs. The space was dimly lit, the flickering overhead light casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls. As I explored, my heart pounded in my chest. I rummaged through boxes of forgotten items, each one telling a story of its own. But I was searching for something specific, the painting that had once held a woman's torment and madness. Just as I was about to give up, I noticed a covered canvas propped against the far wall, draped in dust and shadows. My breath caught as I approached, a sense of dread mingling with an inexplicable urge to uncover it. I hesitated for a moment, the whispers crescendoing in intensity. "Help us! Help us!" With trembling hands, I grasped the edge of the canvas and pulled it away. The sight that met my eyes sent a jolt of terror coursing through me. The painting was a chaotic swirl of darkness, a depiction of anguish and despair that felt alive, as if it were a portal to another realm. In that moment, I understood that this was the source of my nightmares, the embodiment of the darkness that had haunted countless others. The figure from my nightmares was a reflection of the artist's pain, an entity created from her suffering and isolation. I stepped back, my heart racing as the shadows in the painting began to move, swirling and pulsating as if they were reaching for me. I felt the air grow cold, the whispers turning into anguished cries. Join us. Embrace the darkness. But I couldn't let that happen. I had to fight back, to break the cycle. I opened the book I had found, my fingers trembling as I flipped to the page that detailed a powerful banishment ritual. The words felt heavy on my tongue, charged with energy and intent. By the light of truth, I cast you out. I shouted, my voice steadying with each repetition. The air shimmered as I spoke, and the shadows writhed in response, as if recoiling from my words. Leave this place. You have no power over me, I declared, pouring every ounce of my will into the incantation. The painting shook violently, the figure within twisting and contorting in rage. The whispers turned to screams, filling the space with a cacophony of despair. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just banishing the darkness, I was setting the trapped souls free. The anguish that had bound them began to dissipate, the shadows lifting like a heavy fog. I felt the weight of years of sorrow lifting, a release that echoed through the basement. With a final, deafening roar, the darkness imploded, the painting cracking and shattering as light burst forth, illuminating the space in a brilliant glow. I shielded my eyes from the blinding brilliance, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. As the light faded, I found myself alone in the basement, the painting in ruins at my feet, the whispers silenced at last. I collapsed to the floor, breathless and exhausted, but filled with a sense of triumph. I had confronted the darkness and broken the cycle that had ensnared so many before me. Emerging from the basement, I felt the oppressive weight that had hung over my apartment lift. The walls no longer felt like a cage, they felt like a sanctuary. I took a deep breath, allowing the fresh air to fill my lungs, a reminder that I was free. But even in my victory, a part of me knew that darkness would always exist, lurking at the edges of reality. It would be a constant reminder of the fragility of the mind and the strength required to confront one's fears. As I looked out the window, the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city. I was no longer a prisoner of my nightmares. I was a survivor, ready to embrace the light. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of my mind, I could hear the whispers of those who had come before me, their cries now transformed into grateful echoes of release. I had faced the darkness, and in doing so, I had found the strength to reclaim my life. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.